Hi everyone. So today's talk I come bringing an outsider perspective. I am not a NDM researcher. In fact, you could call me like a novice in NDM, right? And the goal of this talk is for those of you who are not familiar with NDM, to sort of give you an idea of what it's like to dive into the literature and the body of work that these amazing researchers have put together, over the last, I'd say, 30 years, nearly 30 years, I'd say. Oh, no, definitely more than 30 years. And hopefully, when you hear my story, I will leave certain breadcrumbs for you to follow, right? Certain books or podcasts or videos, if that's your thing, that I use to sort of dive in and find things that are useful to me. A little bit about myself. I used to run a software engineering house in Vietnam for a Singaporean company. I'm currently based out of Singapore, and it's actually quite late, so I can't stay for the full thing. And my entry into NDM is something that I think many people here would resonate with, which is the expertise of others. So have you ever been in a situation where you've seen someone who could do things that you couldn't, right? It could be in a sport, it could be in your career. Maybe you are a junior developer or a junior person in your company, and then you see somebody who has been there for a very long time and they're able to do something that you're not, right? And when you ask them, right, how do you do that? They'll give you some incomprehensible answer. They'll say something like, it just felt right, or like I did what felt good to me, right? Or they'll say, I knew what to do. And if you push them some more, they would, insert some made up justification, right? Like, I think this, and then they try to on the spot come up with some framework to explain how they were able to know what they knew. But in reality, it was tacit knowledge, right? Like it's basically knowledge that cannot easily be articulated to people. And so if you've ever been in this situation, and I wager that you have, right, searching for an answer of like, how do you get at this knowledge that you can see through their actions that they're able to do, but they can't explain it to you, they can't teach it to you, and yet you want to improve, and it's just right there in front of you, just trapped in the head of the person, right, in front of you. Looking for the answer to that question led me to NDM. And so here it loops back, I think, to where I said I was coming from. So when I was running a software engineering office in Vietnam, right, in Ho Chi Minh City, and this is a photo I took in 2019 that is sort of representative of both the state of software engineering as well as Ho Chi Minh City. I was running a team, and we started out as a consultancy. That means we were building apps for other people, other companies, and we eventually switched to building our own products, and quite successfully. So in a very short period of time, as the business took off, we began to scale up in terms of hiring software engineers, and also like growing the team and then putting some processes in place, because we were growing from a team of 7, then eventually 15, and eventually onwards to like 30 people. And I was responsible for teaching the software engineers that we hired and that we onboarded. And a problem began to become very clear. Like it was clear that it was possible for me to teach them basic things like, here's our code style, and here's the best practices for how we approach the software that we're building. But when it came to higher level skills, right, I eventually realized that we were bottlenecking on one guy, right? And basically we had to depend on my technical lead. So my technical lead was with the company from the early days, even before I joined. And what he was able to do was, when we sat down with a client or a customer, right, and then there'll be the briefing of what the customer wants to accomplish, and given the state of the code base at the time, like what we would have to build for him, right, or for them, my technical lead was able to take in all this information and go like, okay, give me a few hours or give me a day, and then come back with like, okay, so this parts A, B, and C are risky. right? The client may change their mind, or this API is sort of like fishy. We're not really sure what problems might exist with this particular subsystem that we have to rely on. So I'm going to structure the software in this way. And then he would like either tell someone to like structure the skeleton of the software, or he would write the very first prototype to sort of show us like, okay, here's the structure of the function that we're going to build, right? And it would always be rigid in the right places with just enough structure to be well structured that we could build on. And it would be flexible in the places where it was riskiest, where there was the most risk of change. And I eventually realized that if any other senior engineer, myself included, right? If we were to write the software, eventually 3 months, 6 months down the line, we would have to come back and rewrite, because it turned out that, you know, we were building on the wrong assumptions, or it turned out that the client changed his or her mind 6 months down the line, and then we had to throw out a huge amount of work. Whereas if this guy, my technical lead, decided on the structure of the software, we could, you know, pretty much be sure that the structure chosen in the beginning of the project would be the right one, and then we can build on it for months, if not years afterwards. So I quickly realized that we were all bottlenecking on him, right? Like we had to go to him and sort of like get his okay on the structure of the software that we wanted to write for our clients. And this was not a good idea, right? So I started looking for solutions. And when you start Googling for how do you improve and teach people, but you start coming up against things like, you know, deliberate practice, or in software, if you're in software, then you start seeing things like code katas, which is this idea that you can like build certain exercises just like a kata from a martial art, or design patterns that would teach you how to structure programs for certain situations. And of course, there's a lot of incredibly rich information out there about how to study better, right? I'm particularly thinking of Barbara Oakley's famous course on how to learn faster. And in that course, she talked about things like interleaving or spaced repetition, or what do you call it? Looking at learning using diagrams and visual information in addition to textual information. But none of that was useful to me, right? And I think if any of you are, you know, if you've left school and you're in a professional setting, I would argue that many of the techniques drawn from more traditional classroom-based or lab-based research is of limited use to you, because very often, like, what you want to do is you want to learn some skill that there's no syllabus for, right? And an example that I like to give here is you're in a big company and you see some exec, right? You want to be an exec yourself, and you see some exec who's really good at basically playing politics, right? And they're able to use the politics of the organization in a way that can accomplish their goals and push forward their projects. Now that's a skill, right? That's a skill, but there's no way you're going to learn that from a textbook or a course or some kind of formal learning process. So the question for most of us in professional settings was, how do we get the knowledge out from the heads of like these subject matter experts who have somehow learned this skill and then like use it to train other people? Of course, not politics, but in my particular case, like definitely this technical taste and judgment that my technical lead was able to do, and that I could not acquire for myself, much less teach it to others. So anyway, I gave up on this approach and put it aside for a number of years. And I think maybe 3 years later, I was watching a YouTube video between Daniel Kahneman and Michael Malverson at the Santa Fe Institute. And this video is still online. You can search for it, right? The title's there. And in the talk, he made a throwaway comment. Like this was an investment conference, and I think an investor asked the question, you know, what do you think about intuition, right? What do you think about expert intuition in its role in decision making? Something like that. And Daniel Kahneman, sort of just as a throwaway comment, said that like his most fruitful collaboration was with his most fruitful antagonistic collaboration, if you will, was with a person called Gary Klein. And Gary Klein had done work on expert intuition and was an expert on expert intuition. And I stopped the video at that moment and realized, like, wait a minute, is this what I'm looking for? You know, is the thing that I'm trying to get at expert intuition? And are you telling me that there's a body of work around expert intuition? So I stopped the video. I don't think I ever finished the talk. I Googled Kahneman and Klein, And of course, I found the seminal paper that they wrote together, right? Conditions for Intuitive Expertise. And I skimmed the paper, and it seemed like it was exactly what I was looking for. And then I went and got a copy of Sources of Power. And Sources of Power was a revelation, right? I quickly learned when reading it, I think I read it in like 2 days or something like that, right? That expert intuition could be explained, that there was a model. It was not some invisible, magical thing that you could never get at. I also learned that there were methods for extracting such intuitions from the heads of experts. But this was in 1998, and in Sources of Power, I went back and checked the book while preparing for this talk. There wasn't yet, like Gary Klein did not write about like many of the other methods that came after. So in the book, he talked about the critical decision method, which I much later learned was one of the tools, only one of the tools to extract knowledge from the heads of experts. And then I learned that, once you had these extracted pieces of knowledge, you could create training programs for others. In fact, you could do all sorts of very interesting things, right? And most importantly, I learned that there was a subfield of psychology dedicated to the study of these questions, and that it had a horrible name. It was called Naturalistic Decision Making. And the reason why I was not able to find any of these techniques or this entire body of work was because I was Googling for expertise and practice, right? And trying to improve. And the irony here, of course, is that in the book, Gary Klein wrote that he came to this research from an expertise background. And it's just called Naturalistic Decision Making. I'm sure other speakers can, tell a more proper story of like why it's called Naturalistic Decision Making. But naturalistic NDM is seen as an alternative to the broader classical field of judgment and decision making, for better or worse. It meant like novices like me couldn't find it. Anyway, quickly after that, I consumed Gary Klein's Power of Intuition. I was like, okay, there's this field here. I can go and dig into it. I can study it. And I read properly, the paper by Kahneman and Klein, Conditions for Intuitive Expertise. But then I came to a dead end, if you will. At the end of reading these three sources, right, the impression that I got was, very cool. There is a whole body of research around how to extract tacit mental models of expertise from the heads of experts. But the impression I got, especially from Sources of Power, was that, the critical decision-making method is really hard. And in that book, Klein says that, you need around 3 months of training from an existing practitioner to be good at this sort of like incredibly rigorous, incredibly in-depth interview process. But I never considered, what about Klein's colleagues, right? In Power of Intuition, he had already mentioned that the movement was sort of cohering already. What about the other researchers who co-founded the NDM movement, right, alongside Klein? What about Beth Crandall, who did this amazing study on NICU nurses, right? Maybe I should go and dig up their collaborators. I didn't think about that. So I put it aside. I wrote up some of my findings, that sort of like trying to shake people and sort of tell them that this field existed, and there was a whole body of work that we could dig into, right, that explain how expert intuition work. And a couple months later, I discovered the Naturalistic Decision Making podcast, and this is actually how I got to know Brian Moon, and how I got to know Laura Melitello, and how I came to be, speaking here in front of you, right? Like, because Laura Melitello and Brian Moon are the hosts of the NDM podcast, and I listen to every episode. And basically, if you go to the archives and you listen to every episode of the podcast, you will get a taste of what NDM has done, what NDM methods consist of, and what they've accomplished in the last 30 years since that very first NDM meeting in 1989. Right? So I learned that, first of all, the critical decision method isn't the only knowledge elicitation method that existed out there. I learned that in 1998, at the same year that Gary Klein wrote Sources of Power, Laura Melitello and Rob Hutton, both of whom are with us here today, right, created a technique called applied cognitive task analysis. And then I found the paper and I read it, and I realized it was easy enough for an industry practitioner like myself to use. And then I tried it on someone who I met online. His name is John Cutler. He's a product leader at Amplitude, right, the analytics company. And he wanted to write a book on his expertise on being able to quickly size up and and identify problems in product teams and software companies, right? But he didn't know how to write the book because it was all tacit. He just saw the team and he asked a few questions and he knew what was wrong. So I ran ACTA with him and then I wrote about the experience. I also learned that NDM consisted of many interesting extracted models of expertise, right? In sports, I'm probably mispronouncing this, Peter Fade. Team decision making, Eduardo Salas. In IED detection, Brian Moon and Jennifer Phillips, which is a really cool story. And I encourage you to go and listen to Jennifer Phillips' episode. And in business, I was blown away by the fact that in 2008, I believe, Liadi Bello, an NDM researcher, had gone and discovered that there was a mental model, that all great business people shared the same mental model of business, right? And so as I listened, I began to get an idea of like, wait, like these researchers have been doing all sorts of interesting questions. Every sort of interesting question that you might think to ask as a result of some of these methods, right? They've probably already asked it and they probably are digging or have dug into it. You just have to search. Shortly after that, after I'd consumed the entire archive, I reached out to Brian Moon and Laura Melatello and I asked them, what about NDM training methods, right? And they said, go look at Accelerated Expertise, which is a book published not very long ago. I believe it was 2016. I might be wrong. And then I read the book and I realized that if you can extract tacit knowledge, of course, you can also accelerate it. And some of the findings in this book still haunt me. I'm still sort of thinking about them. And I should have realized that this was possible because, in Sources of Power, the very first book that I read, the very first book that Gary Klein published, Klein makes this throwaway comment like, perceptual cues can be defined. This expertise does not have to remain in the realm of the specialist or the intuition of the nurse or paramedic who has seen similar cases. It should be possible to train ordinary citizens. And in Accelerated Expertise, you get a broad view of everything that they've looked at and they've done and accomplished in the years since Gary wrote that sentence. So one last recommendation, apart from the NDM podcast and Accelerated Expertise and all these wonderful books, I eventually went out and got the Oxford Handbook of Expertise. And this is an incredibly heavy book. I spent quite a bit of money getting it shipped all the way to Singapore. This book is a portal, right? Every chapter is a window into the work of some family of researchers in the NDM world, right? And it is an invitation to dig further. I highly recommend that if you're interested in NDM and you don't like podcasts, go get this book, go take a look at, just dive into any of the chapters that interest you and then look at the citations. I think you would be very rewarded. So to wrap up, what has learning NDM meant to me? It's a bit of a relief, actually. There are people asking these questions that seem incredibly obvious if you are a practitioner or you work in industry, right? And these are real, useful, and actionable questions about expertise and decision-making, and usually decision-making in high-stakes situations, right? When I read psychology research, and this is my shade about labs, very often, you read some paper about with some statistical strength or some large set, maybe like run over like 300 undergraduate students over 2 semesters, and then you're like, okay, that's a really cool finding, but how is it useful to me? I have rarely, if ever, in fact, never, I would say, had that experience when I'm reading NDM research. Every time I'm reading NDM research, there's always something useful to take away. There's always some question that I have, like, how can I use this? How can I adapt this to my field? And I think you will find these talks in this open house, as well as these resources that I've outlined over the course of my talk, to be incredibly fruitful starting points for your exploration of NDM. As for myself, I can't wait to learn more. I've only scratched the surface of some of these researchers. I plan to read many, many more papers and many, many more books. Thank you. That's my talk.